We all know the varsity is a staple in Atlanta. Each day, about 15,000 people dine at the location. But there was a point where African Americans like myself couldn't eat the food or even set foot inside. We had to stay out there.
Dude, what you gonna have?
What you have?
Thank you.
You couldn't sit in there while the white people sit and eat. He had to get out the car.
Frank has been working at the varsity for 60 years, and he says back then things were quite different.
Other black people couldn't come in and eat. Just that chauffeur and that maid.
Okay.
See, everybody else had to self this lot.
First of all, it was a segregated area naturally. It was very segregated. And so the varsity, I understand, blacks couldn't even go into the varsity to sit down and eat. Hard to even imagine that kind of lifestyle.
Dan Moore Sr. is the founder of the African American Panoramic Experience, a museum that highlights the African American history. And he says while segregation was abolished, change was slow.
It was about the stigma that they had put on us. We were less than humans, so they didn't have to serve us.
On February 1st in 1960 in Greensboro, 4 North Carolina A&T students waged a sit-in protest at a white-only lunch counter after being refused service. The students refused to move. Over the next 4 days, thousands joined in, and eventually the sit-in spread to other locations in 55 cities across 13 states.
Just to imagine me not being able to go somewhere, me not being able to do certain things just because of my race, it's kind of like a difficult thing to struggle with.
Jordan Thompson was one of several students getting the visual tour of segregated scenes at the Apex Museum. But while much of the country was struggling with desegregation, the varsity was on the forefront of change.
How y'all doing?
But I've heard from our employees that my grandfather was very quick to integrate the varsity. It was very important to him because everybody deserves access to everything.
Hey, a cheeseburger with that?
Gordon Muir's grandfather opened the varsity in 1928. Back then, the 3,000-seat restaurant was a one-room hot dog stand. And as the story goes, in the mid-50s, the varsity became the first restaurant in the area to serve African Americans.
I think he was ahead of the curve on a lot of those things.
See that stop sign? They used to call that the curb house. He could go in there and eat.
Frank says African Americans were no longer turned away. And prior to being allowed inside, the varsity created a drive-through option where blacks got their food from the door and could drive away. Soon after, other restaurants followed.
So we can eat anywhere we want to eat now.
There you go.
I can eat with Gordon now.
That's right. Anytime, Frank.
It just puts life in perspective, just to think about things like that.
Many of the folks who work here now weren't around during the time of desegregation, but they say they can't imagine the varsity any other way. In Atlanta, Bobeth Yates, CBS 46 News.
It's May 1959. A Spelman College professor walks into Atlanta's Central Library for a library card. That might seem like a simple request except for one thing, the color of her skin. Still, there's more to this history that paved the way for her brave act.
Very much a focus of the community.
The early 1900s, activists in Atlanta's black community said it was time they had access to the city's library or one of their own.
The money was appropriated in 1904 by Andrew Carnegie, but it took him until 1921 to actually build the library and open it up.
And so the Auburn Avenue Branch Library came to be.
Books grew in importance to the black community, in large part due to the efforts of the staff at the Auburn branch.
Inside the Auburn branch were librarians eager to make this a hub for their community. One of them, Annie McFeeters, who made it her mission to bring that library to life.
Very much a focus of the community.
Librarian John Wright says that included adult literacy programs, books, and even theater.
McFeeters would go on the radio and talk about things that were happening at the Auburn branch.
All of this leading up to a movement of long overdue change.
Without the Auburn branch, without Annie McFeeters, Irene Jackson may never have been in a position to demand a library card.
Irene Dobbs Jackson was a first.
It was pretty bold, and she said it was very much out of character for her to be that bold. She said she was terrified when she went in, but she did it anyway.
Jackson, who is the daughter of activist John Wesley Dobbs and the mother of Atlanta's first black mayor, Maynard Jackson, studied in France and had free access to check out books there and felt she should be able to do the same at home.
Society at the time was separate.
In 1959, black people could read in the Central Library's basement but couldn't check out books.
The realities that were there, the desire in the black community to be equal and to participate and to have, access to the same resources.
Her request and accomplishment was published in the newspaper, but unfortunately followed by consequence.
People drove by her house and yelled at her house, and they called her on the phone at all hours and what do you want a library card for? Blacks don't know how to read.
The impact of Jackson's actions, everlasting.
She challenged the system. She went in and said, I want a library card. And they went back, heated conversation, and they came back and they gave her a form and said, fill out this form. And she filled it out and they said, we'll give you a call. And she said, yeah, right.
It was a couple of days after putting in that application on May 19, 1959, that the board approved Irene Jackson's library card, making her the first black person in Atlanta to have one. In Atlanta, Yasmina Alston, CBS 46 News.
The Black Panther movie, it's not even out yet. Already, people can't stop talking about it, though.
Yeah, one of the biggest conversations is about black hair and natural hairstyles. As CBS 46's Brittany Miller tells us, the movie has created a movement.
For most of her life, Sarah Lampley felt like she had to hide her natural hair.
I always straightened it, put heat on it, covered it up, because I was ashamed and didn't even realize why.
She felt uncomfortable, even ashamed of the coily curls she was born with. And what made it worse was the poking and prodding from her white peers.
Saying things like, oh, your hair is so cool, your hair is really wild. Oh, look at that girl's hair. Can I touch your hair? Things like that. It makes you feel like you're in a zoo.
Lampley isn't alone. Like many black women, Deborah Shigley also wondered how she could embrace her kinks when smooth, straight hair was the pinnacle of beauty.
For so long, women of color have not really felt included in the major beauty trends, the major beauty moments.
Until now.
We're getting a lot of requests for Black Panther-inspired hairstyles, mostly natural.
As the creator of Color, an app that brings your hairdresser to your home, Shigley says braids, twists, locks, and Bantu knots are keeping her stylist busy. She blames Black Panther, saying the movie has made textured hair a trend.
This is really a seminal moment with the Black Panther movie. It is the first time where you've seen so many different natural hairstyles in the movie.
And it's so empowering as a black woman to see that and feel like you can be confident, you can wake up, you can wear your hair. You don't have to cover it up with a wig or braid it down or put extensions in. You can wear your hair as is, and it's beautiful and it's accepted.
As Lampley falls in love with her new look, she hopes highlighting natural hair will help people highlight who they are.
It's more than just hair. It's like this movement.
So the countdown is on. Black Panther hits theaters this Friday. Make sure you go check it out. Brittany Miller, CBS 46 News.
We continue a series of firsts throughout February, and there are so many to celebrate. This month, we're honoring the achievements of African Americans.
Well, here in a city that is so diverse, it was only 70 years ago that Atlanta got its first black police officers. CBS 46's Vince Sims sat down with the department's #2 in charge. They talked about the history and challenges faced back then and where the department is today.
This area, as you can see, is coming back to that splendor.
Atlanta Assistant Police Chief Rodney Bryant reminds us of how the Edgewood area once was.
It was clearly thriving at that time.
It was also one of the few places the black officers on the Atlanta police force could patrol.
This is the only area that they would have been able to be in at that time.
That time was 1948. 70 years ago, these 8 men were Atlanta's first African-American police officers, ranging in age from 21 to 32. All but one was a World War II veteran.
We owe so much to these 8 pioneers who decided to take on the responsibility of being the first. They were not well received by white police officers and even some blacks in the community.
Assistant Chief Bryant, who is number 2 in command of the Atlanta Police Department, shows us the Butler Street YMCA. This is where those first black officers worked from. They weren't allowed in police headquarters.
These officers weren't allowed to socialize with the white officers. They had to go to Butler Street YMCA and change their uniforms there.
They also had limited powers on the street.
They weren't able to arrest white citizens. They were only able to patrol certain areas of town.
Some of the limits placed on those 8 actually led to what is known today as community policing.
They weren't allowed to drive cars, so they walked footbeats. And that allowed them to have a closer relationship with the community that they served. They had to overcome some significant hurdles to get us into the place that we are today.
Today, the department is very diverse, with more than 50% minority.
I grew up in the city of Atlanta, and so I was here during some times where I saw police officers have an effect on our community, both in negative and positive ways.
Bryant joined the force in 1988 at a young age and is now the assistant chief of the department.
Their efforts, we stand on the shoulders of these giants today.
Bryant admits, although the force is much more diverse 70 years later, there are still challenges today.
Nothing that's not addressed professionally. It clearly is nowhere. We've come a very, very long way from 1948.
Having come a long way, he takes pride in his position and responsibilities placed on him. He's the lead person on the department's role in Super Bowl 53 coming to Atlanta next year.
It's an honor to have that level of responsibility, to be entrusted with being able to put on an event of that stature.
Bryant credits the bravery of then-Mayor William Hartsfield, Police Chief Herbert Jenkins, and those 8 black officers.
The initial stage may be very difficult, but if not for them, we don't know when blacks would have joined the police department.
Because they did, Bryant wants to give his all to honor their actions.
I want to continue to serve the community that I love in any aspect that I can.
So interesting to learn that history. Another key factor in white members of the department accepting the blacks, well, it was in 1950. The 12th black officer hired was killed in the line of duty. It's reported that's when some of the white officers acknowledged the sacrifice of those black officers.
Well, it's just a tremendous thing to learn, to think that you had to change, not even in the headquarters, but in the YMCA. And if you were allowed, you said, in the headquarters in later years, you had to change in the basement, to now helping to keep us safe when the world will be watching during a Super Bowl. Strength, perseverance, and excellence.
And a diverse force that represents the city that we live in as well, so you can see how it's changed. Yeah. And again, that's all in just 70 years.
Yeah. Makes you proud. It's a small fraction of time when you think about it. Vince, thank you. Great story.
We continue our series of firsts throughout February, and there are many to celebrate throughout the month. We're honoring the achievements of African Americans. And today is, of course, Ash Wednesday. Did you know Atlanta has the only African American archbishop serving the Catholic Church?
As our Karen Greer learned, Archbishop Wilton Gregory was called to service at an early age, and his achievements, they've changed the landscape of the Catholic Church.
Good morning.
For the Most Reverend Wilton D. Gregory, the call to service came while he was still in elementary school in the late 50s on Chicago's South Side.
There was just a lot of Catholic motion going on, and I was intrigued. So I told the pastor, John Hayes, that I was going to be a priest. And his famous line, which I've quoted many times, he said, "You know, Wilton, it would be helpful if you were Catholic."
It was the height of the civil rights movement. Racial turmoil and unrest all over the country. But the young Gregory was serious about his calling, and so was his grandmother.
The total charge for the 3 Gregory kids for 1 year was $76. But even that was a challenge, so my grandmother told the Adrian Dominicans that she would cook the Sunday meal and help with the laundry to pay the tuition.
Every Tuesday after school, Gregory met with a priest for private lessons to become Catholic. Gregory was ordained a priest at the age of 25, earned his doctorate in liturgy in Rome, and later became an auxiliary bishop in his hometown of Chicago, before being installed as a bishop over the entire diocese of Belleville, Illinois.
Good morning, guys.
Good morning.
Spent 11 wonderful years in Southern Illinois, loved those people to death, and came at a very difficult time in the history of that diocese. The sexual abuse issue had really consumed that diocese.
Gregory served as vice president and then president of the U.S. Council of Catholic Bishops as one of the largest scandals of the Catholic Church continued to unfold, this time nationally.
A high-ranking official in the archdiocese.
It was the sexual abuse issue that consumed my 3-year term as president.
24 priests.
In 2001, lawsuits were filed alleging that thousands of priests had sexually abused minors, and in many cases, their superiors conspired to cover it up. Gregory was committed to exposing members of the Catholic clergy who were abusing the children.
John Paul II himself, he asked me, was I sure that these events took place? And I told him, absolutely, Holy Father, and worse.
After Gregory's presidency, it was time for reflection and a move south.
Our compassion, 9 days after I finished being president, concluded my term, Pope John Paul II named me the Archbishop of Atlanta, which, in the estimation of a lot of people, that was his way of affirming the things that I did for the church.
He's the third in Atlanta, but he's the only African-American archbishop in the U.S. A bishop can be very isolated if he chooses to. In fact, he can be very isolated unless he chooses to do the opposite.
Thank you so much for coming.
And he actually does the opposite. Gets out into the parishes.
Thank you. God bless.
Karen Greer, CBS 46 News.